There are places on earth where the land itself seems to shape the destiny of those who dwell upon it. The Eurotas Valley, in the southern reaches of what we now call Greece, is such a place. Stand at its heart, and you are surrounded by mountains that rise like the walls of a fortress built by the gods themselves. To the west, Mount Taygetos pierces the clouds, its peaks so high that snow clings to them even in summer. To the east, Mount Parnon stands as a gentler but no less formidable guardian. Between them runs a river valley so fertile, so perfectly positioned, that it would become the crucible of one of history's most extraordinary civilizations. Picture, if you will, the year 1100 before Christ. The Bronze Age is ending. Great kingdoms are collapsing across the Mediterranean world. The Mycenaean palaces that once dominated Greece are burning, their Linear B tablets recording final desperate inventories before darkness swallows their civilization whole. Into this chaos come the Dorians, fierce warrior peoples moving south through the mountain, passes with bronze-tipped spears and a hunger for land that can sustain them. When these bronze-armed invaders descended into the Eurotas Valley, they found paradise. The river that gives the valley its name flows year-round, fed by mountain springs that never fail. The soil is deep and black, capable of producing harvests that could feed armies. Wild game fills the forests on the mountain slopes, and perhaps most remarkably, the valley's geography makes it almost impossible to conquer from without. Any enemy approaching from the north must navigate narrow mountain passes, where a handful of determined defenders can hold back thousands. The coastal approaches from the south are equally treacherous, with no natural harbour to land invasion forces. The Dorians understood immediately what they had found. This was not merely good land. This was a natural fortress, a place where a people could make themselves nearly invincible simply by controlling the high ground and the passes. Here, they would not need to build great walls like other cities. The mountains themselves were walls enough, but conquest creates its own questions. The invaders found the valley already inhabited by people who had farmed these lands for generations. What do you do with a conquered population when you cannot afford to simply drive them away? The Dorians made a choice that would echo through the next 700 years. Rather than kill or exile the valley's original inhabitants, they would dominate them utterly, transforming them into a permanent underclass that would work the land while the conquerors devoted themselves entirely to the arts of war. Among these Dorian warriors were two brothers who claimed descent from Heracles himself, that greatest of Greek heroes. Their names were Eurysthenes and Procles, twins born to continue a divine bloodline. They established something unique in the Greek world, a dual monarchy. Two kings would rule Sparta simultaneously, one from each royal house, sharing power in an arrangement so unusual that foreign ambassadors arriving in later centuries never quite knew which throne to approach first. It was a system born perhaps from necessity, preventing civil war between rival claimants, but it would prove remarkably stable. For over 500 years, these two royal lines would endure, providing Sparta with leadership that was both consistent and prevented from becoming tyrannical. Consider what these early Spartans chose not to do. Other Greek peoples, facing the challenges of overpopulation and limited resources, turned to the sea. They became traders, colonizers, founding settlements across the Mediterranean and Black Sea. They built merchant fleets and grew wealthy through commerce. The Spartans looked at the fertile land they had conquered and made a different calculation. Why sail to uncertain futures when everything they needed was here? Why risk wealth on trade when they could take what they wanted from their neighbors? In the 8th century before Christ, Spartan spears turned westward toward Messenia. The First Messenian War lasted 20 years, a grinding, brutal conflict fought in mountain passes and olive groves. King Theopompus led his warriors year after year into Messenian territory. The shield that Spartan warriors carried bore a single letter, lambda, marking them as Lacedaemonians. Those lambda-marked shields became symbols of terror to their enemies. When Messenia finally fell, the victorious Spartans made another fateful choice. They did not merely conquer Messenia, they enslaved an entire people. 10,000 Messenians became helots overnight. Neither slaves in the traditional sense nor free men, they occupied a strange middle ground. They could not be bought or sold individually, yet they were bound to the land, forced to work Spartan farms and surrender half their harvest to their masters. Entire families, whole communities, were transformed from free farmers into permanent servants. The mathematics of this arrangement were stark and dangerous. The helots outnumbered their Spartan masters by 10 to 1, perhaps more. Every Spartan child grew up knowing that they lived on top of a volcano of resentment that could erupt at any moment. How do you sleep soundly when those who serve your meals hate you? How do you turn your back on the field workers who could, at any moment, turn their farming tools into weapons? The answer the Spartans developed was the krypteia, a word that means secret things. Each year, the ephors, the elected magistrates who held significant power in Sparta, would formally declare war on the helots. This was not metaphorical. It was an actual declaration that made killing helots legal, even ritually necessary. Young Spartan men in their final years of training would be sent out into the countryside with nothing but a dagger and orders to hunt the most dangerous game imaginable. Helots who showed signs of strength, intelligence, or leadership potential. They would creep through the darkness, these young warriors, learning to move without sound, to kill without hesitation. The helots they murdered were not criminals. They were simply too strong, too clever, too likely to organize resistance. It was systematic terror, coldly calculated to keep the subject population cowed and leaderless. We recoil from such brutality today, yet we must understand it to grasp how Sparta functioned. The krypteia was not cruel excess. It was the foundation upon which Spartan society rested. The prosperity that flowed from helot labor allowed the Spartans to make yet another revolutionary choice. They would dedicate themselves entirely to war, not part-time soldiering, not citizen farmers who picked up spears when needed, but full-time professional warriors. To prevent the corrupting influence of wealth, they developed an extraordinary monetary system. Spartan currency consisted of iron bars, deliberately made too heavy and cumbersome to hoard or trade easily. Imagine trying to accumulate a fortune when each coin weighs several pounds and rusts. Try purchasing goods from foreign merchants when your money cannot leave your borders without enormous effort. This iron currency was genius in its way. It prevented the concentration of wealth that plagued other Greek cities. It made corruption difficult. How do you bribe someone with currency that has no value outside Sparta? It forced Spartans to remain Spartans, unable to transform themselves into merchants or traders. They would eat what their land produced, wear what their helots and craftsmen made, and measure wealth not in gold, but in honor, discipline, and military excellence. The young Spartans celebrated their victory over Messenia with the first Gymnopaedia, a festival that would become a cornerstone of their culture. For 3 days, in the height of summer, men danced naked under the burning sun, until their feet bled, offering their pain and endurance to Apollo Karneos, the god they believed protected their city. There was no shame in this nakedness, no embarrassment in this suffering. It was a declaration: we are hard enough to endure what would break other men. We glory in discipline and pain because these things make us unconquerable. Yet even in triumph, the seeds of eternal anxiety were planted. Visit Sparta at any point in its history, and you would find a civilization living with one eye always looking over its shoulder. The helots working the fields were not grateful subjects but conquered enemies who outnumbered their masters overwhelmingly. Every harvest season brought the question, will they rise this year? Every Spartan woman sending her son to training knew that he might one day die, not in glorious battle against worthy foes, but murdered in his sleep by resentful servants. This perpetual fear shaped everything that would follow. It made Spartans obsessed with unity, with conformity, with the subordination of individual desires to collective security. A city divided against itself could not watch the helots. A population that valued personal wealth over communal strength could not maintain the vigilance that survival demanded. The famous Spartan austerity, their rejection of luxury and comfort, flowed not from some abstract philosophical choice but from cold necessity. Soft men could not hold down a population that hated them. As the 7th century before Christ dawned, Sparta stood at a crossroads. They had conquered their neighbours and established a system that freed them to focus entirely on war. They had created institutions, the dual kingship, the council of elders, the assembly of warriors that provided stability. They had developed a culture that valued collective discipline over individual glory, but they had not yet become the Sparta of legend. They were powerful, yes, but still recognizable as a Greek city-state like others. What came next would transform them into something unprecedented in human history. They would systematically strip away everything that made other humans comfortable, warm, secure. They would take their children from their mothers at 7 years old and forge them in a crucible of suffering that would horrify civilized peoples. They would create a machine for producing warriors so effective, so terrifying, that the mere sight of their crimson cloaks would cause enemy armies to flee without fighting. This transformation required a catalyst, a lawgiver whose name would become synonymous with discipline itself. Whether he was a real man or a collective myth, whether his laws came from human wisdom or divine inspiration, matters less than the revolution he unleashed. Lycurgus was coming to Sparta, and nothing would ever be the same. The mountains that surrounded the Eurotas valley had given the Spartans natural defences. The conquest of Messenia had given them economic security, but neither geography nor agriculture would be enough to sustain what they were about to become. They needed something more fundamental, more ruthless, more completely dedicated to a single purpose than any society had ever attempted. They were about to embark on the greatest and most terrible social experiment in Western history. They would prove that humans could be shaped like bronze, heated and hammered and cooled until they held an edge sharper than any natural material. They would demonstrate that comfort was weakness, that mercy was danger, that only through the most extreme discipline could a people make themselves truly free. The eagles still circle Mount Taygetos today, riding thermals above peaks that have watched human civilizations rise and fall like brief candle flames. The Eurotas still flows through its valley, though the language spoken on its banks has changed many times. But in that 7th century before Christ, something was stirring in that valley that would send ripples through all of human history. The forge was being prepared, the hammer was being raised, and a generation of children was about to be transformed into living weapons. There are moments in history when a single individual, or perhaps the idea of an individual, changes everything. Around 650 years before Christ, a figure emerged from the mists of legend who would transform Sparta from a powerful city-state into something the world had never seen before. His name was Lycurgus, and whether he was a real man who walked the streets of Sparta or a collective myth created to justify radical reforms, matters less than the revolution he represents. The stories say that Lycurgus travelled to Crete, to Egypt, even to distant lands beyond the known world, studying how different peoples organized their societies. The stories say he consulted the oracle at Delphi, that sacred sanctuary where Apollo spoke through his priestess, and received divine approval for the laws he would impose. The stories say that he made the Spartans swear an oath not to change his laws until he returned from one final journey, and then he never came back, starving himself to death in exile to make his laws eternal. What we know with certainty is that the great rhetra, the great pronouncement, reshaped Spartan society with surgical precision. It created a system so comprehensive, so all-encompassing, that it would regulate virtually every aspect of Spartan life for the next 400 years. And at its dark heart was a simple, terrible question: how do you create the perfect warrior? The answer began with children. Imagine a Spartan mother on a winter morning, holding her 7-year-old son for the last time. She has known this day was coming since his birth. She has prepared herself for it, steeled her heart against the natural love that binds mother to child. Her son's long hair, which marked him as a boy of her household, is cut away. He is taken from her arms by older boys, led away to the Agoge, the upbringing where he will remain for the next 13 years. She will see him again, of course. He will return home occasionally, awkward and increasingly distant, becoming someone she no longer quite recognizes. But the child she held that morning is gone forever. The Agoge does not train boys to be warriors. It manufactures warriors from the raw material of boyhood, breaking them down and rebuilding them into something harder, colder, more perfectly suited to a single purpose. The boys are organized into herds, led by older youths who have already survived years of this existence. They are given a single cloak, red wool that must serve as clothing, blanket, and shelter. They wear it year-round. Sleeping on reed beds, they gather themselves from the banks of the freezing Eurotas River. In summer, the thin cloth provides inadequate protection from the burning sun. In winter, it offers almost no warmth against mountain winds that howl down from Tegetos with snow on their breath. They are deliberately underfed, not starving precisely, but kept in a state of constant hunger that drives them to steal food to survive. And here is the cruel genius of the system. They are punished not for stealing but for getting caught. A boy who steals food successfully demonstrates cunning, boldness, the ability to move undetected through hostile territory. A boy who gets caught demonstrates only incompetence, and incompetence is beaten out of them with willow switches until the lesson is learned. There is a famous story, almost certainly apocryphal but revealing nonetheless, of a Spartan boy who stole a fox and hid it under his cloak when its owner approached. Rather than reveal his theft, the boy stood silently while the fox tore into his stomach with its claws. He maintained his expression, answered questions normally, and only when he collapsed did the adults realize what had happened. By then, his intestines were shredded. He died without crying out. Whether this specific incident occurred matters less than what it tells us about Spartan values. Pain was temporary, shame was eternal. A warrior who would break under torture could not be trusted with his comrades' lives. Better to die than to show weakness. Better that children learn this lesson early, when the stakes are relatively low, than discover it in battle when failure means betraying brothers in arms. The training intensified as boys grew older. They learned to fight, of course, but not in the way other Greeks learned. There was no instruction in individual heroics, no glorification of champions who broke ranks to win personal glory. The phalanx was everything, and the phalanx demanded perfect unity. Imagine a wall of bronze, 8 rows deep, shields locked together so tightly that not even a spear point could find purchase between them. The men in the front rank thrust with their spears in perfect synchronization, while those behind pressed forward with their shields, adding their weight and strength to make the formation immovable. To maintain this formation required absolute trust. The hoplite on your right protected your exposed side with his shield. You protected the man on your left. Break formation, and you exposed your brothers to death. Run, and you murdered everyone who depended on you. The lesson was hammered home day after day, drill after drill, until it became more fundamental than breathing. Your shield belongs to your comrade more than to yourself. Your life is not your own to throw away in pursuit of glory. The unit survives or dies together. At the altar of Artemis Orthia, the goddess of the wild places, 12-year-old boys underwent the diamastagosis, the ritual flogging. They stood before the altar, while older youths whipped them, competing to see who could endure longest without crying out, without flinching, without showing any sign that they felt pain at all. The whips were not symbolic. They cut through skin to muscle, drawing blood that ran down backs and pooled on ancient stones that had drunk the blood of hundreds of boys before them. The winner earned cheese and barley bread placed on the altar. The boy who cried out or collapsed earned contempt that would follow him for years. Foreign observers watched these proceedings with horror and fascination, wondering what kind of people would do this to their own children. The Spartans saw it differently. War was agony. Wounds were agony. Watching your friends die was agony beyond any physical pain. Better that boys learn to endure agony early, in a controlled setting, than discover in battle that they could not bear what was required of them. As the boys progressed through the agoge, they learned things beyond combat and endurance. They studied music, particularly the martial songs and poems that celebrated Spartan victories and shamed cowards. They learned to speak with precision and economy, giving rise to the word laconic from Laconia, Sparta's region meaning brief and to the point. When Philip of Macedon later threatened Sparta with the message, "If I enter Laconia, I will raze Sparta to the ground," the Spartan ephors replied with a single word, "if." They learned to read, though Sparta produced almost no written literature compared to Athens. They learned the stories of their ancestors, particularly the tale of Thermopylae that we shall explore later, where 300 Spartans held off the Persian Empire. They learned that death in battle was not tragedy but triumph, the culmination of everything their training prepared them for, the moment when they could finally demonstrate that they had become worthy of their crimson cloaks. At age 20, those who survived the agoge, and not all did, between accidents, disease, and the deliberate culling of those deemed too weak, became full Spartan citizens. They were assigned to a Sicyon, a dining club of about 15 men who would be their closest companions for life. These were not merely social arrangements. The men of your Sicyon were your phalanx rank, the warriors you would stand beside in battle, the men who quite literally held your life in their hands every time war came. And the Sicyon was where the famous austerity of Spartan life became most apparent. Each member contributed food from the land. His helots worked barley, wine, cheese, figs. The main dish was black broth, a soup made from pork, blood, salt, and vinegar that was notoriously foul. There is a story of a foreign king who dined at a Spartan mess and declared the broth revolting. His Spartan host replied that it only tasted good if you had first bathed in the Eurotas River, meaning that only those who had endured Spartan training could appreciate it. The point was not the taste. The point was uniformity, simplicity, the rejection of luxury that might soften warriors or create resentment between rich and poor. When you ate the same plain food as your king, when you wore the same simple cloak, when your house was no grander than your neighbour's, there was no basis for the class conflicts that tore other Greek cities apart. In the Sicyon, there was only brotherhood and equality of hardship. But what of the other half of Sparta's population? What of the women? Here Sparta diverged even more dramatically from other Greek cities. In Athens, respectable women lived in near seclusion, managing households but rarely appearing in public. In Sparta, women ran naked in foot races, their oiled bodies gleaming in the sun while crowds watched. They wrestled in the gymnasiums, threw javelins, trained their bodies to be as strong and disciplined as their brothers. The reasoning was brutally practical. Strong mothers bore strong children. Women who understood discipline and sacrifice would raise sons worthy of Sparta. And with their husbands often away at war or living in barracks, women needed to be capable of managing estates, making decisions, defending themselves and their property. Spartan women owned approximately 40% of Spartan land, an unthinkable arrangement in most of the ancient world. Marriage itself became a curious ritual, reflecting Sparta's unique values. The bride's head was shaved, and she was dressed in men's clothing. She waited alone in a dark room. The groom, still living in his barracks, would sneak away from his secession, spend a brief time with his bride, and then return before his absence was noticed. Some couples produced 2 or 3 children before ever seeing each other in daylight. This was not cruelty, but calculation. The bonds between warriors must be stronger than the bonds between husband and wife, or the phalanx would break. Spartan women were famous for their laconic severity. The most famous saying attributed to them was given to sons departing for war: "Come back with your shield or on it." The shield was the heaviest piece of a hoplite's equipment, weighing 15 to 20 pounds. A warrior fleeing battle would discard his shield to run faster. A dead warrior would be carried home on his shield by his comrades. The message was crystal clear: victory or death. Do not return in defeat. There is another story, perhaps historical, perhaps legendary, of a Spartan mother whose 5 sons all fell in battle on the same day. When a messenger brought her the news, she reputedly asked, "Did we win?" When told that Sparta was victorious, she replied, "Then I am content," and went to give thanks at the temple. This may seem inhuman to us, but it reveals the depths to which Lycurgus's system reshaped human nature. Personal loss was subordinated entirely to collective triumph. Individual lives mattered less than the survival and glory of Sparta itself. The weak, or those deemed weak, had no place in this system. Infants born with obvious deformities or sickness were taken to the apothete, a chasm on the slopes of Mount Taygetos, and left to die. This was not considered murder, but quality control. In a society where every citizen must be a warrior, and where the population was always outnumbered by hostile helots, there was no room for those who could not fight. It was coldly logical and utterly ruthless. Yet for all its harshness, the system produced exactly what it was designed to create. By the end of the Agoge, a Spartan warrior was perhaps the most formidable individual fighter the ancient world had ever produced. He could endure heat, cold, hunger, thirst, and pain without complaint. He would stand in the phalanx and die before breaking ranks. He valued his honor and his comrades above his own life. He had literally been trained since childhood to view death in battle not as tragedy, but as the fulfillment of his purpose. And multiplied across thousands of such warriors, locked together in perfect phalanx formation, this created a military force that was effectively unbeatable in pitched battle. Other Greek city-states fielded citizen militias who trained part-time. Sparta fielded professional soldiers who had trained since age 7. When a Spartan phalanx took the field, its opponents faced not merely an army, but a perfectly synchronized war machine that had been 300 years in development. The iron currency ensured they remained focused on war rather than wealth. The secession ensured their loyalty to brothers in arms exceeded their loyalty to family. The Agoge ensured that weakness was culled early, and strength was cultivated ruthlessly. The dominance over the helots provided the economic foundation that freed citizens for constant military readiness. Every element reinforced every other element, creating a system of interlocking supports that made Sparta simultaneously invincible and deeply fragile. For all its strength, this system contained fatal vulnerabilities that would only become apparent much later. It produced superb warriors, but no artists, no philosophers, no scientists. It created military excellence but prevented the economic growth and innovation that were enriching other Greek cities. Most critically, it depended entirely on maintaining a stable population of full Spartan citizens, and any system that routinely kills weak children and loses men to constant warfare will struggle with demographics over time. But in the 6th and 5th centuries before Christ, as the system reached its full development, these weaknesses were not yet apparent. What was apparent to all Greece was that Sparta had accomplished something unprecedented. They had created a society where every citizen was a full-time warrior, where individual comfort was sacrificed entirely for collective military power, where children were shaped like clay into living weapons. They had proved that humans could be systematically hardened beyond what anyone thought possible, and they were about to be tested in a way that would forge their legend forever. To the east, beyond the Aegean Sea, a vast empire was stirring. Persia, ruler of millions, master of armies that drank rivers dry, was turning its gaze toward tiny Greece. The warriors that Lycurgus had created were about to face the ultimate test of their training. The forge had done its work, the warriors were ready, and the world was about to learn what Spartan discipline truly meant when tested against impossible odds. There are moments in human history when everything hangs by a thread, when the fate of civilizations rests on the courage of a few standing against impossible odds. The summer of 480 years before Christ was such a moment. The largest army ever assembled was marching toward Greece, and standing in its path was a force so small it seemed almost a cruel joke. Xerxes, king of kings, ruler of the Persian Empire that stretched from India to Egypt, had spent 4 years preparing for this invasion. His father Darius had failed to conquer Greece a decade earlier, defeated by Athenians at Marathon. Xerxes would not fail. He assembled an army so vast that ancient historians claimed it numbered over 2 million men, though modern scholars suggest perhaps 200,000, still a force beyond anything Greece had ever faced. The preparations alone were legendary. Engineers built a bridge of ships across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. When storms destroyed the first bridge, Xerxes ordered the sea itself whipped 300 times as punishment, a gesture that Greeks saw as evidence of Persian hubris. The second bridge held, and the army crossed, taking 7 days and 7 nights of continuous marching for the entire force to reach European soil. As this vast host moved through Thrace and into Thessaly, Greek spies brought reports that seemed impossible to believe. The army drank rivers dry. Its passage turned green countryside into barren waste. Whole cities submitted without resistance, seeing no point in fighting the inevitable. The northern Greek states quickly offered earth and water, the traditional symbols of submission to the Persian king. By late summer, the army was approaching the heart of Greece, and nothing seemed capable of stopping it. The Greek city-states held emergency councils. Athens had a powerful navy, but walls that could not withstand siege. Thebes was already negotiating surrender. Corinth, Argos, and other cities debated whether resistance was even possible. And Sparta, the preeminent military power of Greece, was celebrating the Carneia, their sacred festival to Apollo Carneos. The Carneia lasted 9 days. During this time, religious law absolutely forbade Spartan armies from marching to war. To break this taboo would offend the god who protected Sparta, inviting disaster. The other Greeks pleaded desperately. The Persians were coming now, not after some convenient festival. If Sparta did not march immediately, Greece would fall before the Carneia ended. King Leonidas, middle-aged and seasoned by countless battles, found a solution that was technically legal, if spiritually questionable. He would not take Sparta's army. He would take only his personal bodyguard, 300 men, who happened to be the finest warriors Sparta possessed on what was technically not a military campaign but a royal procession. This force was small enough that it did not constitute the army marching to war, yet significant enough to make a difference. Perhaps the 300 men Leonidas selected were all veterans with living sons. This was not coincidence. They were men whose bloodlines would continue even if they fell, ensuring that their Spartan citizenship would not die with them. They were men in their prime, hardened by years of combat, proven in the phalanx. They knew, as they kissed their wives and children goodbye, that they were unlikely to return. The place where they would make their stand was called Thermopylae, the hot gates, named for the sulphur springs that bubbled up from the ground. filling the air with the stench of the underworld. Here, the coastal road from northern Greece into the heart of the peninsula narrowed to a pass only 50 feet wide at its narrowest point, hemmed in by steep mountains on one side and cliffs dropping to the sea on the other. An army of millions could only come through this bottleneck in a relatively narrow column. It was the perfect place for a small force of determined warriors to hold back a massive invasion. Leonidas arrived to find about 7,000 allied Greek soldiers already gathered, Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, and contingents from other cities, but everyone knew which warriors mattered most. When word spread that Spartans had arrived, even in such small numbers, hope stirred among the defenders. Perhaps, just perhaps, they could hold long enough for the rest of Greece to prepare. The Persian army approached like a slow-moving storm. From the Greek positions, the defenders watched the horizon, darken with dust raised by hundreds of thousands of marching feet. Then, the dust resolved into ranks of soldiers that seemed to stretch forever, broken into regiments from every corner of the vast Persian Empire. There were Medes in leather armor, Scythian archers whose composite bows could shoot farther than any Greek could throw a javelin, Indian warriors with steel weapons, Ethiopian spearmen, Thracian cavalrymen, a catalogue of the known world's warriors, all marching under the Persian banner. Xerxes, secure in his overwhelming numerical advantage, sent a herald to the Greek positions with a simple demand: surrender your weapons. Leonidas's response became instantly legendary. 2 words in Greek: molon labe, come and take them. The Persian king gave the defenders 4 days to reconsider, certain that the sight of his vast army would break their will. Surely these Greeks, seeing they faced annihilation, would accept the generous terms he offered. He could not comprehend men who would choose death over submission. The Spartans spent those 4 days calmly preparing, exercising naked in view of the Persian positions, oiling their long hair in the ritual fashion of warriors preparing for battle or for death. Persian scouts reported this behavior to Xerxes, who consulted Demaratus, an exiled Spartan king now in his court. Demaratus explained that Spartans groomed themselves with special care when they expected to die. They were making themselves beautiful for their own funeral rites. Xerxes laughed, still not quite believing that men would willingly die in a cause already lost. On the 5th day, the attack began. Xerxes sent his Median infantry forward in massive waves, confident that sheer numbers would overwhelm the Greek positions. What happened next became the template for one of history's most famous last stands. The phalanx formation that Spartan training had perfected proved devastatingly effective in the narrow pass. The Persians came on in loose formation, individually brave, but lacking the cohesion that Spartan drill had instilled since childhood. They crashed against a wall of bronze shields locked together with geometric precision. Behind those shields, Spartan spears thrust out in perfect synchronization, each warrior knowing exactly where his comrade's weapons would be, creating a lethal barrier that no individual courage could penetrate. The Persians in front tried to retreat from this meat grinder, but the mass of men behind pushed them forward. They died by the hundreds, trampling each other in their desperation to escape Spartan iron. The pass became slick with blood, bodies piled up so high that attackers had to climb over their own dead to reach the Greek line. Wave after wave of Persian infantry crashed against the phalanx and broke. The Spartans fought with mechanical efficiency, their training reducing combat to simple execution of drilled movements. Thrust. Step. Thrust. When spears shattered against Persian armor, they drew their Xiphos swords and continued. When men in the front rank fell, those behind stepped forward to fill the gaps without hesitation, the wall remaining unbroken. By evening of the 1st day, Xerxes had lost thousands of men. The Greeks had held. The Persian king could not comprehend it. How could so few withstand so many? The answer lay in terrain, training, and equipment. The narrow pass negated Persian numbers. Spartan training meant every warrior knew his role perfectly. And Greek armor, heavy bronze breastplates, full helmets, large shields provided far better protection than the lighter equipment worn by most Persian infantry. On the second day, Xerxes sent forward his immortals, the elite troops of 10,000 men who formed his personal guard. They were called immortals because whenever one fell, he was immediately replaced, keeping their number constant. They were the finest warriors Persia possessed, veterans of countless campaigns, men who had never failed their king. Surely they would break through where ordinary troops could not. The immortals discovered they were quite mortal when facing Spartan discipline. The phalanx held, the spears thrust. The bronze wall remained unbroken. By the end of the second day, Xerxes had lost thousands more men. Some reports claimed 10,000 or more, and had gained not 1 inch of ground. The Persian king was reportedly seen rising from his throne 3 times in anxiety and fury, watching his invincible army being slaughtered by a handful of Greeks. The defenders, for their part, were in surprisingly good spirits. They had proven that Greek discipline could defeat Persian numbers. Messages were being sent south, buying precious time for Athens to evacuate civilians and for the Greek fleet to position itself at Artemisium. Every hour the defenders held was another hour for Greece to prepare. Leonidas rotated his Greek allies, keeping his Spartans always in the front line, and the men joked darkly about how many Persians each had killed. There is a famous exchange from these days. A Spartan warrior named Dienekes was told by a local that Persian arrows were so numerous they would block out the sun. Dienekes laughed and replied, "Good, then we shall fight in the shade." This was not bravado but genuine Spartan humor, finding amusement in impossible odds, facing death with a grin and a jest. But on the third day, betrayal arrived in the form of a local Greek named Ephialtes. For a promised reward of Persian gold, he revealed to Xerxes what the defenders' greatest fear had been. There was a mountain path, narrow and treacherous, that wound around the pass and would allow the Persians to attack from behind. The Phocian troops stationed to guard this path were surprised in the night by the immortals, led by Ephialtes. Some fought, most fled. By dawn of the third day, the Persians were moving to encircle the Greek position. Leonidas held a council of war as dawn broke. The tactical situation was now impossible. Encircled, the defenders would be slaughtered, but if the pass was completely abandoned, the Persian army would pour into central Greece unhindered. The decision he made would echo through history. He dismissed most of the Allied forces, ordering them to retreat while they still could. Their deaths here would serve no purpose, and Greece needed every warrior it had for the battles to come. But the 300 Spartans would remain, along with the Thespians who refused to leave, and some Thebans whose loyalty was suspect, possibly hostages rather than volunteers. Why did Leonidas order his Spartans to stay when he sent the others away? The practical answer is that someone had to hold the pass long enough for the retreating Greeks to escape, but there was more to it than tactics. An oracle had prophesied that either Sparta would fall or a Spartan king must die. Leonidas chose to fulfill the prophecy. His death here would secure Sparta's future and inspire all of Greece to united resistance. The final morning, Leonidas and his men knew they would not see another sunset. They ate their last meal with unusual appetite. When someone expressed surprise, Leonidas replied that they should eat well, for they would dine in Hades that evening. It was neither bravado nor despair, but simple statement of fact, delivered with the laconic wit that Spartans were famous for. As the final Persian assault began, the Spartans fought with abandon. No longer trying to preserve formation or conserve strength, they surged forward from the wall they had been defending, attacking with fury that shocked even the Persians who had been fighting them for days. Their spears shattered. They fought with swords. Their swords broke or were knocked from their hands. They fought with daggers, with fists, with teeth. Leonidas fell early in this final assault, a Persian arrow taking him through the eye. What followed was a battle within a battle. The Spartans formed a circle around their king's body, defending his corpse with desperate ferocity. Twice the Persians captured it, twice the Spartans took it back. The struggle over Leonidas's body became the symbolic heart of the battle warriors, fighting not for victory, but for honor, to ensure their king received proper funeral rites. When the Persians finally encircled the position, the last Spartans retreated to a small hillock, dragging their king's body with them. They still had a few weapons. More importantly, they still had defiance, as Persian arrows fell like rain, so thick that the air darkened with them. The remaining defenders locked their shields together one last time. The archers had to shoot for several minutes before the last Spartan fell. The Persians had won. The pass was open, but they had paid a price beyond calculation. Thousands of their finest warriors lay dead in a pass that should have been taken in an afternoon. More critically, Greece had seen that Persians could be beaten. The myth of Persian invincibility was shattered, and Sparta had demonstrated that death was not the worst thing that could happen to a warrior. Shame was far more terrible. Xerxes, touring the battlefield after, found Leonidas's body among the dead. In a rage, whether at the casualties the Spartan king had inflicted or in grudging respect for his courage, Xerxes ordered Leonidas beheaded and his body crucified. This was meant as ultimate dishonor. To Greeks, it proved how much the Persians feared Spartan courage even in death. The 300 became instant legend. Poets commemorated them. Monuments were raised. But the story was not finished. The Persian army moved south, sacking Athens, burning the temples on the Acropolis. It seemed that Leonidas had died merely to delay the inevitable. Greece still faced destruction, but something remarkable had happened at Thermopylae. The Greek city-states, always fractious and competitive, had seen what unified resistance could accomplish. They had seen Spartans and Athenians and Thespians standing together. They had seen that Persian gold did not make Persian soldiers braver than Greek iron made Greek warriors deadly. Most importantly, they had gained time. 1 year after Thermopylae, the Greek allied army faced the Persians at Plataea in Boeotia. This time, Sparta sent its full army, 10,000 Spartan hoplites plus 35,000 helots serving as light infantry. Leading them was Pausanias, regent of Sparta, nephew of Leonidas, and a tactical genius who would prove that Thermopylae was not a defeat, but an investment whose dividends were about to be paid. The Persian army at Plataea was still massive, perhaps 100,000 strong, commanded by Mardonius, the Persian general who had led the army after Xerxes returned home. Mardonius was confident. He had defeated Greek armies before. He held fortified positions with abundant supplies. He had cavalry that could harass the Greek infantry mercilessly. Pausanias displayed strategic patience that would have made Leonidas proud. For 11 days the two armies maneuvered without decisive engagement, each seeking advantage. The Persians disrupted Greek water supplies. The Greeks maintained their formations, refusing to be drawn into the open, where Persian cavalry could devastate them. It was a chess game played with tens of thousands of human pieces. On the 11th night, Pausanias ordered a nighttime withdrawal to more defensible positions near Plataea city. The movement was complex and risky, and like most nighttime redeployments, it became confused. By dawn, the Greek forces were scattered and seemingly vulnerable. Mardonius saw his opportunity. He ordered a general advance, confident that he could destroy the disordered Greeks before they could reform, but Pausanias had anticipated this. As the Persians advanced, he ordered the Spartans to form phalanx. In minutes, the scattered troops coalesced into that perfect wall. Of bronze and iron that had held at Thermopylae, the Persian infantry and cavalry crashed against it and broke. What followed was slaughter. The Spartans, fighting now not in a narrow pass but in open ground with room to maneuver, demonstrated the full terror of their discipline. They advanced in perfect step, shields locked, spears thrust in unison. The Persian infantry, brave as individuals but lacking the cohesive training that made the phalanx effective, could not stand against it. They broke and ran. Mardonius, fighting at the front of his troops in a last desperate attempt to rally them, fell beneath Spartan spears. With their general dead, Persian resistance collapsed. What had been an orderly retreat became a rout. The Greeks pursued, killing by the thousands. Of the 100,000 Persians who began the battle, perhaps 40,000 survived to flee back to Asia. The rest died in the fields of Plataea or were captured trying to escape. The victory was total and decisive. Xerxes' dream of conquering Greece died in the summer dust of Boeotia. Pausanias, standing among the slain, reportedly gazed at Mardonius's elaborately decorated pavilion with its gold and silver furnishings, and ordered it preserved. He then had the Persian cooks prepare a feast using Mardonius's supplies, while he ordered his own cooks to prepare a Spartan meal of black broth and barley. Gathering the Greek commanders, he pointed to the two meals and said, "See how foolish the Persian king was. He enjoyed such luxury, yet came to rob us of our poverty." The 300 who died at Thermopylae had bought time for this victory. Their sacrifice had inspired Greece to unite. Their example had shown that Persians could be beaten by warriors willing to stand firm. Thermopylae was not meaningless delay, but essential prologue. The hot gates had been the crucible that forged Greek resolve. Plataea was where that resolve brought salvation. Greece was saved. Western civilization, philosophy, democracy, reason survived to develop rather than being absorbed into the Persian Empire. And Sparta stood as the acknowledged military champion of the Greek world, their warriors having proven themselves the finest soldiers the ancient world had produced. The legend of the 300 would never die. 2,500 years later, people still know their story. The epitaph that Simonides of Chios composed for the Spartan dead at Thermopylae remains one of history's most famous short poems. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." Those two lines capture everything essential about Sparta. Not that they died courageously, many warriors have died courageously. Not that they fought against impossible odds, many have faced overwhelming forces. But that they died obediently, fulfilling the demands of their laws and their training, doing exactly what Spartan society had shaped them since childhood to do. They did not die because they were ordered to. They died because being Spartan meant standing in the phalanx until death took you or victory crowned you, and there was no third option. Thermopylae and Plataea together established Sparta as something more than a powerful city-state. They became the symbol of what discipline, training, and willingness to sacrifice could achieve. For the next century and a half, no Greek power would seriously challenge Spartan military supremacy. The scarlet cloaks became synonymous with invincibility. The lambda-marked shields inspired terror and respect wherever they appeared. But victory contains its own dangers. Success can breed arrogance. Supremacy can create complacency. The Spartans who marched home from Plataea were the finest warriors in Greece. They had saved their civilization. They stood at the peak of their power and reputation. What they did not yet know was that their greatest test was not behind them but ahead. The defeat of Persia made Sparta supreme, but supremacy would reveal weaknesses that military excellence alone could not address. The system that had created perfect warriors was about to be tested not by foreign invasion, but by the complexities of empire, the seductions of power, and the slow erosion of the very qualities that had made them great. There is a particular burden that comes with being acknowledged as the greatest. When you have proven yourself supreme in your chosen field, the world expects you to remain supreme forever. Any sign of weakness becomes magnified. Any failure becomes catastrophic. Sparta, having saved Greece from Persian conquest, now faced a challenge perhaps more difficult than any battle: how to manage the peace they had won. The decades following Plataea should have been Sparta's golden age of uncontested dominance. They were the acknowledged military masters of Greece. Their scarlet cloaks commanded instant respect. When Spartan ambassadors spoke in the councils of Greek city-states, their words carried the weight of 300 warriors standing at Thermopylae, of 10,000 advancing at Plataea. No one doubted Spartan courage. No one questioned Spartan discipline. And yet, within a generation of their greatest triumph, Sparta would face a crisis that no amount of phalanx drilling could solve. The earth moved first. In the year 464 before Christ, a massive earthquake struck Laconia with devastating force. Buildings that had stood for centuries collapsed in seconds, the walls that Spartans had finally built conceding that even their warrior prowess needed some architectural support crumbled like dried mud. Most catastrophically, the gymnasiums and barracks where young men trained collapsed while full of warriors. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of Spartans died in moments, crushed under falling stone and timber. Imagine the psychological impact. These were men who had spent their entire lives preparing for death in battle, who welcomed combat as the fulfillment of their purpose, who feared nothing that could be faced with spear and shield. And they died trapped under rubble, unable to fight, unable even to defend themselves. It was the kind of death that Spartans feared most meaningless, unheroic, a waste of all that training and discipline. The Helots heard the rumbling, saw the destruction, and recognized opportunity. For generations, they had outnumbered their Spartan masters, but lacked the courage or coordination to rise up. The earthquake changed the calculation. With so many Spartans dead, with the survivors scattered and disorganized, with weapons buried in collapsed armories, the Helots struck. It was not just rebellion, it was an attempt at genocide, to finally overthrow the warriors who had enslaved their ancestors 7 generations earlier. King Archidamus saved Sparta through the very discipline that the earthquake had seemed to render useless. As buildings fell and people panicked, he ordered the war trumpet sounded, signaling an enemy attack. It was a lie, but it was the lie that Sparta needed. Warriors scattered throughout the city heard that familiar sound, and responded as countless hours of training had conditioned them to respond. They grabbed whatever weapons they could find and formed ranks. They assembled into phalanx formation because that was what Spartans did when threatened, as automatically as breathing. When the Helot uprising arrived, instead of finding confused survivors picking through ruins, they faced organized resistance. The element of surprise was lost. What might have been a successful massacre became a failed attack. The Helots retreated to the mountains, where they would wage guerrilla warfare for years, but the opportunity to destroy Sparta in a single blow had passed. Yet the damage was done. Sparta's population of full citizens had been declining for generations. Losses in battle, the high standards that excluded many from citizenship, the practice of leaving weak infants to die, all contributed to a shrinking pool of Spartiates. The earthquake accelerated this crisis dramatically. Some estimates suggest that Sparta lost nearly 2,000 citizens in the earthquake and subsequent uprising, reducing their full citizen population to perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 adult males. Think about what this meant. The system Lycurgus had created required large numbers of Spartan citizens to control far larger numbers of Helots. It required enough warriors to form multiple armies, garrison subject cities, and maintain dominance over the Peloponnese. It required a critical mass of men to sustain the Syssitia and maintain the Agoge. As citizen numbers dropped, every remaining Spartan became more valuable and therefore less expendable. A state built on willing sacrifice in battle was becoming demographically unable to afford casualties. But in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, these long-term problems were not yet apparent. Sparta still commanded respect and fear. When Athens, Sparta's reluctant ally during the Persian Wars, began building an empire of its own through the Delian League, a defensive alliance that gradually became Athenian imperial dominion, Sparta watched with growing concern. The two cities represented opposing visions of what Greek civilization could be. Athens was democracy, naval power, commerce, culture, innovation. They built magnificent temples like the Parthenon. They hosted dramatic festivals where poets competed. They engaged in philosophical debate in public marketplaces. They welcomed foreign traders and adopted new ideas with enthusiasm. The Athenian ideal was the well-rounded citizen who could fight when needed, but also discuss Homer, participate in government, and appreciate sculpture. Sparta was oligarchy, land power, agriculture, tradition, and conservatism. They built no great temples, their monuments were the warriors they produced. They produced almost no literature or art. They viewed innovation with deep suspicion. Foreign visitors were discouraged, and new ideas were treated as potential corruption. The Spartan ideal was the warrior who could fight perfectly and needed no other skills because fighting was the only skill that mattered for a citizen. These were not merely different political systems, they were fundamentally incompatible worldviews, and as both grew stronger, conflict became inevitable. The Peloponnesian War, which erupted in 431 before Christ and would last 27 years, was more than a territorial dispute. It was a civilizational war to determine which vision of Greece would prevail. The war itself was a study in the strengths and weaknesses of both systems. On land, Sparta remained supreme. When Spartan armies marched into Athenian territory, the Athenians retreated behind their walls rather than face the phalanx in open battle. When Sparta's allies rebelled, Spartan warriors crushed the rebellions with brutal efficiency. The scarlet cloaks inspired terror wherever they appeared. A single Spartan warrior was worth several ordinary soldiers, and everyone knew it. But Athens had the sea. Their navy was the finest in Greece, funded by silver mines and manned by skilled rowers. They could supply their city by sea even when Spartan armies ravaged their farmlands. They could strike coastal cities across the Peloponnese, forcing Sparta to garrison widely separated strongholds. And most frustratingly for Sparta, there was no way to bring Athens to battle on Spartan terms. The phalanx was useless against ships. The war dragged on, bleeding both cities. Sparta produced a remarkable commander in Brasidas, a general who understood that warfare involved more than just battlefield excellence. He combined military skill with diplomacy and charm, convincing northern Greek cities to defect from the Athenian alliance, not through fear, but through persuasion. He promised that Spartan hegemony would be less oppressive than Athenian imperialism, that oligarchic stability was preferable to democratic chaos. Brasidas nearly won the war through these methods. His campaigns in Thrace and Macedonia threatened Athens's grain supply and timber resources. City after city opened its gates to him, won over by his personal honor and his promises of freedom under Spartan protection. When he died in battle at Amphipolis in 422 before Christ, even his Athenian enemies wept. He represented what Sparta could have been: militarily excellent but also politically sophisticated, strong but not merely brutal. His death removed the one Spartan commander who understood that empire required more than just superior warriors. The war continued for another decade until the Peace of Nicias established an uneasy truce. Both sides were exhausted. Both had lost thousands of men. Neither had achieved decisive victory. It seemed possible that Greece might find some way to accommodate both Athenian and Spartan power, but Athens made a catastrophic mistake. In 415 before Christ, they launched an expedition to conquer Syracuse in Sicily. It was an ambitious campaign that, if successful, would have given Athens control of Sicily's vast grain resources and extended their empire across the western Mediterranean. The expedition was massive, over 100 ships, thousands of soldiers, the cream of Athenian military might. The Syracusans requested help from Sparta. Here was the dilemma Sparta always faced. Sending warriors abroad meant fewer warriors at home to guard against Helot uprisings. But Syracuse's plea could not be ignored without losing face. Sparta sent Gylippus, a competent commander, with a relatively small force to assist the defence. What happened in Sicily was Athens' worst nightmare. The Athenian expedition was completely destroyed. Thousands died. Thousands more were captured and worked to death in Syracusan quarries. An entire generation of Athenian soldiers and sailors was lost in a single disastrous campaign. Athens, which had seemed on the verge of controlling all Greece, was suddenly vulnerable. Sparta saw its opportunity and struck. But here is where Spartan pragmatism revealed itself in ways that would have shocked Lycurgus. To finally defeat Athens, Sparta needed a navy. To build and maintain a navy required gold, and the only source of gold available in sufficient quantity was Persia, the empire that Leonidas had died fighting, that Pausanias had defeated at Plataea, that represented everything opposed to Greek freedom. Lysander, the Spartan admiral who would ultimately win the war, had no qualms about accepting Persian gold. He was a new kind of Spartan, politically cunning, diplomatically skilled, willing to do whatever was necessary for victory. He was not noble Brasidas, winning through honour and persuasion. He was ruthless, manipulative, and effective. He understood that wars were won not just on battlefields but through economic pressure, political manipulation, and strategic patience. With Persian funding, Sparta built a fleet that could challenge Athens at sea. Lysander cultivated a relationship with Cyrus, the Persian prince governing Asia Minor, securing not just gold but naval expertise and shipbuilding resources. He systematically attacked Athens' grain supply routes, forcing the Athenians to fight naval battles they could not afford to lose. When Athens won, they gained nothing. When they lost, their strategic position worsened. The end came at Aegospotami in 405 before Christ. Lysander caught the Athenian fleet beached and unprepared, destroying it almost without a fight. It was not a glorious victory. There was no heroic battle, no test of courage or skill. It was simply excellent intelligence, perfect timing, and ruthless execution. The Athenian navy ceased to exist. Athens could no longer feed itself. Surrender was inevitable. When Athens' long walls came, down in 404 before Christ, Spartan pipers played victory songs while Athenian women wailed. The war that had consumed 2 generations finally ended with Sparta supreme. They had won. They were the undisputed masters of Greece. The Spartan system had proven superior. Everything Lycurgus had created had been validated, except it hadn't. Sparta had won the Peloponnesian War by abandoning core Spartan principles. They had accepted Persian gold, violating their contempt for wealth. They had built a navy, diverting resources from land warfare. They had engaged in diplomacy and political manipulation, activities that traditional Spartans viewed as barely preferable to cowardice. Lysander himself represented a new kind of Spartan leader, ambitious, self-promoting, willing to cultivate personal power rather than subordinating himself entirely to the state. Sparta installed the 30 tyrants to rule Athens' oligarchs who were supposed to create a stable, Sparta-friendly government. Instead, they launched a reign of terror so brutal that it made democracy look appealing. They executed over 1,500 Athenians, confiscated property, and ruled through fear. Within a year, even Spartans were uncomfortable with what they had created. When Athenian democrats overthrew the 30, Sparta did not intervene forcefully to restore them. The entire episode revealed Sparta's fundamental weakness. They could conquer but not govern. King Agesilaus, who came to power in 398 before Christ, seemed to promise a return to Spartan excellence. He was intelligent, personally austere despite his royal status, and an excellent battlefield commander. He led campaigns into Persian territory, marching where Alexander the Great would later march, making Persian satraps tremble. He won victories in Asia Minor that seemed to herald a new era of Spartan glory. But every victory created new problems. Spartan garrisons had to be established in conquered cities. Spartan advisors had to manage subject states. Sparta's allies grew to resent their protectors. The perioikoi, the free non-citizens who lived in Spartan territory and served in Spartan armies, began to question why they fought in Spartan wars but received no share in decision-making. Most critically, every year Sparta spent garrisoning an empire was a year when fewer men could be produced through the agoge. The mathematics were inexorable. Sparta's full citizen population continued to decline. Estimates vary, but by the middle of the 4th century before Christ, there may have been only about 3,000 adult male Spartiates. 3,000 to control hundreds of thousands of helots and perioikoi, to garrison subject cities, to maintain hegemony over Greece. The phalanx remained invincible when you could fill its ranks, but there were no longer enough men to fill multiple phalanxes. Wealth, that ancient enemy of Spartan discipline, began seeping into the system. The iron currency remained, but ways were found around it. Rich Spartans accumulated land as poorer Spartans lost theirs. The law required every citizen to contribute to his succession. Those who could not afford the contribution lost their citizenship. As economic inequality grew, the citizen rolls shrank further. The system was eating itself. Yet Sparta remained militarily dominant through sheer reputation. When Spartan ambassadors arrived in other Greek cities, when Spartan armies marched to war, enemies still trembled. The memory of Thermopylae and Plataea cast a long shadow. The visible proof of Spartan discipline warriors who moved in perfect unison, who obeyed instantly, who seemed to welcome death in battle, continued to intimidate. A Spartan phalanx had never been broken in pitched battle. That fact mattered more than demographic statistics. Agesilaus led Spartan armies to victory after victory in Asia Minor. He sent gold back to Sparta, Persian gold seized as plunder, adding to the corruption that Persian subsidies during the Peloponnesian War had begun. He established Spartan supremacy so thoroughly that it seemed permanent. When he was recalled to Greece to face threats from Thebes and other Greek cities growing restive under Spartan dominance, he believed he was simply dealing with minor irritants before returning to greater conquests in the east. He did not understand that Sparta's golden age was already ending. The system that had created perfect warriors had assumed those warriors would die in battle before growing old, that new warriors would always be produced in sufficient numbers to replace losses, that economic equality would prevent the kind of class conflicts that weakened other cities. All these assumptions were failing simultaneously. More dangerously, success had bred a kind of arrogance. Spartans believed their own legend. They assumed that discipline and courage were sufficient for any challenge. They did not adapt their tactics because they believed they did not need to adapt. The phalanx had worked for 300 years, so why change it? They did not address their demographic crisis because they could not imagine Sparta without the existing social system, and the system demanded more citizens than it was producing. In Thebes, a brilliant general named Epaminondas was studying Spartan tactics with the analytical precision of a surgeon planning an operation. He identified weaknesses that Spartans did not believe they had. He developed innovations that Spartans would dismiss as unnecessary complications. He was preparing to do what many believed impossible: break the Spartan phalanx in pitched battle. But in the years before Leuctra, before the impossible happened, Sparta enjoyed its brief moment at the pinnacle of power. Their armies marched where they wished. Their decisions determined Greek politics. The Scarlet Cloaks were synonymous with victory. They were masters of Greece, proven in battle after battle, seemingly invincible. They did not see the edge of the cliff approaching. They did not recognize that mastery contains the seeds of its own destruction, that every system eventually meets forces it cannot overcome, that even perfect warriors are still only human. The phalanx had held at Thermopylae against impossible odds. It had crushed the Persians at Plataea. It had dominated Greek battlefields for generations, and very soon it was going to break. There are moments in history when the impossible becomes reality, when assumptions that have held for centuries shatter in an afternoon, when the unthinkable happens and nothing is ever the same again. The 6th of July, 371 years before Christ, was such a day. At a place called Leuctra in Boeotia, the foundation of Spartan power cracked, and the sound echoed across the Greek world. To understand the magnitude of what happened at Leuctra, you must first understand what it meant to be Spartan. For 300 years, since Lycurgus had established the agoge and created the phalanx system, Spartan warriors had been considered invincible in pitched battle. Sparta had lost wars, they had been defeated at sea, outmaneuvered politically, frustrated strategically. But when Spartan hoplites formed phalanx and advanced, shields locked and spears levelled, they did not break. They did not run. Every Greek warrior knew this as fundamental truth, like knowing that stones fall downward or that summer follows spring. This was not mere reputation. It was historical fact validated by generations of combat. At Thermopylae, they had held against impossible odds until surrounded. At Plataea, they had destroyed the Persian army. Throughout the Peloponnesian War, Athenians had refused to face Spartan armies in open battle because everyone knew how such encounters would end. Even in minor engagements, even when outnumbered, Spartan phalanxes either won or died in place. They never ran. This invincibility was both psychological and tactical. Psychologically, it meant that enemies were defeated before combat began. Soldiers facing Spartan warriors knew they faced men who had trained since age 7 for this exact moment, who would die before fleeing, who moved with mechanical precision that made them seem almost inhuman. The scarlet cloaks approaching across a battlefield inspired the kind of primal fear that no amount of courage could completely overcome. Tactically, the phalanx itself was nearly perfect for the kind of warfare Greeks practiced. 8 rows deep, shields overlapping, spears projecting forward in 4 bristling rows, it was a mobile fortress. The men in front fought while those behind pressed forward with their shields, adding weight and momentum. When the front rank tired, they could rotate back through the formation. The entire mass moved in perfect step, turned in unison, advanced or retreated on command. Individual excellence mattered less than collective cohesion, and no one cultivated cohesion like Spartans. But perfection is brittle. A system optimized for one type of problem becomes vulnerable when facing problems it was not designed to solve. And in Thebes, a man named Epaminondas had been thinking very carefully about the Spartan phalanx and how it might be broken. Epaminondas was everything Spartans were not. He was a philosopher, a student of Pythagorean mathematics and mysticism. He loved music and poetry. He lived simply by choice rather than compulsion. He never married, dedicating himself entirely to Thebes and to a vision of what Greek warfare could become. And he understood something that Spartans, in their rigid adherence to tradition, had failed to grasp. Tactics were not eternal truths, but tools that could be improved, adapted, revolutionized. He studied how Spartans fought and identified their patterns. The Spartans always placed their best troops on the right wing, a Greek tradition stemming from the fact that a warrior's shield protected his left side, so the vulnerable right flank of the formation needed the strongest fighters. In phalanx versus phalanx combat, 2 formations would advance, collide, and push against each other. Victory usually came when one side's right wing broke through the enemy's left, then wheeled to attack the enemy formation from the side. Spartans were so good at this that other Greek armies often conceded the right-wing battle as lost and tried to win decisively on their own right wing before the Spartans could roll up their line. It was less a matter of tactics than of accepting reality. You could not beat Spartan elites in a straight fight, so you had to win somewhere else faster than they could win against you. Epaminondas conceived something radical. What if you refused to play by these rules? What if, instead of spreading your forces evenly, you massed overwhelming force at one point and accepted weakness everywhere else? What if you deliberately made your phalanx deeper on one side, not 8 men deep, but 50 men deep? Such a formation could not maneuver as easily, but it could hit with sledgehammer force at a single point. More radically, Epaminondas proposed to place this deep formation on the left wing, directly opposite where Spartans placed their best troops. Instead of avoiding the strongest point of the Spartan line, he would attack it with concentrated power, and he had the perfect unit to lead this attack: the Sacred Band of Thebes. The Sacred Band consisted of 150 pairs of male lovers, 300 men total, bound together by romantic love as well as military duty. The Greeks did not see this as unusual. Such relationships were common in their culture. What made the Sacred Band extraordinary was the motivation it provided. Each warrior fought beside his beloved. Each knew that death was preferable to showing cowardice before the one he loved most. Each would die before allowing his lover to be killed. It created a level of devotion and desperate courage that equaled or even exceeded Spartan discipline. In 371 before Christ, the Spartans marched north to punish Thebes for various provocations. King Cleombrotus commanded about 10,000 Spartan troops. Likely only around 700 of these were full Spartiates, the rest being perioikoi and allies. The numbers are debated by historians, but what mattered was that this was a significant Spartan army led by a reigning king, the same combination that had won at Plataea and countless battles since. The armies met at Leuctra. The Spartans formed in traditional phalanx, Cleombrotus and the elite Spartans on the right wing as always. They saw the Theban formation oddly weighted toward the left, and no doubt assumed it was a mistake born of inexperience. They advanced confidently, certain they would win as Spartans always won. What happened next happened quickly. Epaminondas's deep column on the left wing struck the Spartan right with devastating force. Imagine a normal wave hitting a beach, then imagine a tsunami. The difference in impact was similar. 50 ranks of warriors, moving together, hit the Spartan elite with such momentum that even perfect training and discipline could not hold. The physics were irresistible. Mass times velocity equals force, and Epaminondas had maximized both. The Spartan right wing, attacked by vastly superior numbers at the point of contact, began to give ground. This alone was shocking. Spartans did not give ground, but as they fell back, compressed by the Theban pressure, their formation became disordered, and once the phalanx lost its perfect cohesion, its advantage disappeared. Individual Spartans were still superb warriors, but separated and surrounded, they began to fall. King Cleombrotus was killed in the initial clash. The best warriors Sparta possessed died around him, trying to protect their king's body as Leonidas's men had died at Thermopylae. But this was not Thermopylae. This was not 300 men choosing to die for a greater strategic purpose. This was the main Spartan army in pitched battle, the situation where they were supposed to be invincible, and they were losing. As the Spartan right collapsed, panic spread through the rest of their line. The perioikoi and allies, seeing the invincible Spartans broken, did not stay to die gloriously. They ran. The battle became a rout. 400 Spartans died at Leuctra. Some sources suggest 400 out of 700 Spartiates present. In a single afternoon, Sparta lost more than half of the pure Spartan citizens who had marched north that morning. 400 dead Spartans. To understand what this meant, remember that Sparta's full citizen population was perhaps 3,000 at most. They had lost more than 10% of their entire adult male citizenship in one battle. Families that had produced warriors for generations ended that day. The phalanx that had never broken in pitched battle had broken. The news reached Sparta during the Gymnopedia festival, that same festival where warriors danced naked under the summer sun to honor Apollo. The officials who received the news made a decision that reveals everything about Spartan values. They did not stop the festival. They did not announce the disaster publicly. They quietly informed the families of the dead, instructing them to grieve in private, and allowed the celebration to continue. Sparta would show no public weakness, even in catastrophe, but private grief could not hide strategic reality. The myth of Spartan invincibility died at Leuctra. Every Greek city-state that had submitted to Spartan hegemony out of fear suddenly reconsidered. If Spartans could be beaten in pitched battle, if their phalanx could break, if their warriors could run, then perhaps they were not demigods, but merely men. Epaminondas, sensing the magnitude of what he had achieved, did not stop with one victory. He marched into the Peloponnese itself, something that had not happened in living memory. Spartan territory was supposed to be inviolable. Spartan women, seeing enemy campfires from their windows, wailed that the world was ending. They had never imagined foreign armies camping in sight of Sparta. Most catastrophically, Epaminondas marched into Messenia and proclaimed it free. The Helots, who had been slaves for nearly 400 years, who had suffered under the Crypteia and annual declarations of war, who had harvested Spartan fields for generations, suddenly were told they were free men. Messene rose as an independent city. The agricultural foundation of Spartan power was destroyed overnight. Without Messenia, Sparta could not feed its population. Without surplus food, there was nothing for Spartiates to contribute to their syssitia. Without the syssitia, the bonds that held the warrior class together weakened. Without enough food production, the economic system that had allowed every citizen to be a full-time warrior collapsed. A single military defeat had triggered systemic failure. Desperate times produced desperate measures. Sparta began freeing helots who would fight as soldiers, trying to fill ranks that could no longer be filled by citizens alone. They armed criminals and outcasts. They hired mercenaries, foreign professionals who fought for pay, the antithesis of the citizen warrior ideal Lycurgus had established. Each compromise weakened the system further. King Agis III, ascending to power several decades later, recognized that Sparta was dying and attempted radical reform. He proposed to cancel all debts many Spartans had borrowed money, trying to maintain their succession contributions and redistribute land more equally. This would restore the economic equality that had once underpinned Spartan citizenship. More citizens could meet the property requirements. More young men could afford to complete the agoge. The warrior class could be rebuilt. The wealthy ephors, those elected magistrates who held enormous power in Sparta's mixed government, saw these reforms as theft. They saw Agis as a revolutionary tyrant who would destroy their privileges. In an act almost unthinkable in earlier Spartan history, they arrested Agis, tried him in a kangaroo court, and executed him. A king of Sparta, descended from Heracles, was hanged like a common criminal. His mother and grandmother, who supported his reforms, were executed alongside him. This execution revealed how far Sparta had fallen. The kings who had led warriors at Thermopylae and Plataea now died at the hands of their own officials. The unity that had made Sparta strong had shattered into factionalism. Rich Spartans defending their wealth cared more about their property than about restoring Spartan power. The system that had subordinated individual desires to collective good now enabled individuals to destroy the collective for personal gain. Cleomenes III, succeeding to the throne years later, took a different approach. Where Agis had tried reform through legal channels, Cleomenes launched a coup. He killed the ephors who opposed him, exiled his enemies, and implemented Aggis's reforms by force. He cancelled debts, redistributed land, and restored something resembling the old Spartan system. For a brief period, it seemed Sparta might actually be revived. Cleomenes even won battles, proving that Spartan warriors properly trained and equipped could still be formidable. He seemed to be dragging Sparta back from the abyss through sheer force of will, but he faced a problem that no amount of will could overcome: Macedonia. While Greece had torn itself apart through endless intercity warfare, Philip II of Macedon had been building a new kind of military power in the north. His innovations made the traditional Greek phalanx obsolete. His sarissa spears were 20 feet long, twice the length of traditional Greek spears, giving Macedonians overwhelming reach advantage. His army combined heavy infantry, light troops, and cavalry in coordinated tactics that Greek city-states could not match, and his son Alexander would prove even more devastating. Cleomenes' reformed Sparta faced the Macedonian army at Silesia in 222 before Christ. The Spartans fought with all the courage and discipline their ancestors had displayed, but courage and discipline were not enough against superior numbers, better equipment, and more sophisticated tactics. The Macedonian phalanx, with its forest of long spears, simply outreached Spartan weapons. Macedonian cavalry swept around Spartan flanks and attacked from behind. It was a comprehensive, total defeat. Cleomenes fled to Egypt, hoping to raise support for another attempt. He died there attempting yet another coup, killed in street fighting in Alexandria, the last Spartan king who genuinely tried to restore Lycurgan Sparta. With him died the hope that the old system could be revived. What followed were the death throes of Spartan independence. Various tyrants and reformers tried to rule Sparta, each attempting different solutions to insoluble problems. Nabis, ruling in the late 3rd century before Christ, was perhaps the most radical. He freed large numbers of slaves, redistributed land aggressively, brought in foreign mercenaries, and essentially abandoned traditional Spartan social structure entirely. He turned pirates into admirals and criminals into soldiers. By traditional Spartan standards, he was a monster, destroying everything Lycurgus had built. By practical standards, he was desperately trying to save Sparta by any means necessary. It did not work. Rome was rising in the west, and Rome would not tolerate independent powers in Greece. When Roman legions finally marched into the Peloponnese, Spartan warriors fought them with traditional courage, but Roman military organization was as superior to Greek phalanxes as Macedonian tactics had been. The legion, with its flexibility and adaptability, systematically dismantled Greek formations. Sparta became a Roman client state, permitted nominal independence but effectively controlled by Rome. The warrior state that had dominated Greece for centuries, that had saved Western civilization from Persia, that had produced the finest soldiers the ancient world had known, was reduced to a curiosity. Spartans still went through the Agoge, still dined in Cilicia, still performed their ancient rituals, but these were now theatre, performances of a dead tradition maintained for tourists and nostalgic Romans. The system Lycurgus had created contained the seeds of its own destruction. It required constant population replacement but created conditions that reduced population. It required economic equality but contained no mechanism to prevent wealth concentration as conditions changed. It required absolute dedication to war, but that very dedication prevented the diplomatic flexibility necessary for managing an empire. Most fatally, it assumed that discipline and courage were sufficient for any military challenge, preventing adaptation when enemies developed superior tactics and technology. At Leuctra, the impossible had happened, the Spartan phalanx broke, but the real breaking was slower and more comprehensive. It was the breaking of assumptions, the breaking of a social system, the breaking of a vision of what warriors and citizens could be. Sparta did not fall in a day. It unraveled over decades, each compromise weakening the system further, each defeat making revival more difficult, until finally the warriors who had once terrified Greece became performers in staged battles for Roman entertainment. The men who died at Leuctra did not know they were dying for a dying cause. They fought as Spartans had always fought, with discipline, courage, and absolute commitment. That their courage was insufficient, that their discipline could not overcome superior tactics, that their commitment could not save a flawed system, was not their failure. They were simply the generation where centuries of accumulated problems became catastrophes, where structural weaknesses that could be ignored during strength became fatal during challenge. The phalanx had broken at Leuctra. But Sparta itself, the idea, the legend, the symbol of what discipline and sacrifice could achieve that would prove harder to break, even in defeat, even in decline, even reduced to tourist attraction, Sparta would continue to fascinate and inspire. The warriors were gone, but the memory of what they had been would echo through the ages. There is a particular sadness in watching greatness fade, in seeing institutions that once inspired awe reduced to shadows of themselves, in witnessing proud warriors becoming entertainers for conquerors. The final centuries of Sparta's independence were a slow descent from power to irrelevance, punctuated by brief flickers of the old glory that only made the darkness afterward seem deeper. After Silesia, after Cleomenes' desperate attempt to restore traditional Sparta ended in comprehensive defeat, something fundamental changed. The Spartans who survived, and many did survive, retreating behind their city's defences, were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The system that Lycurgus had created 700 years earlier might simply be obsolete. The world had moved on. New forms of warfare, new technologies, new political arrangements had emerged, and Sparta's rigid adherence to tradition was not strength but paralysis. Yet tradition was all they had left. Take away the Agoge, the Syssitia, the scarlet cloaks and lambda-marked shields, and what was Sparta? Just another small Greek city-state with no natural resources, no great harbour, no particular strategic value. The mystique was everything, and so they clung to the forms even as the substance drained away like water from a cracked vessel. Rome's rise changed everything about the Mediterranean world. The Romans were practical, organized, brutally effective. They studied the military systems that had come before them: Greek phalanxes, Carthaginian tactics, Celtic fury, and adopted what worked while discarding what didn't. They created legions that were flexible where phalanxes were rigid, adaptable where traditional systems were fixed. A Roman legion could fight in close formation like a phalanx, spread out for skirmishing, form defensive squares, wheel and maneuver in ways that Greek hoplites never could. When Roman power extended into Greece, Sparta faced choices that would have been unthinkable to earlier generations: submit to Rome and maintain nominal independence, or resist and be destroyed. For a warrior state that had never accepted submission, for men who had been taught since childhood that death was preferable to dishonor, this choice was agonizing. They submitted, because what else could they do? The population that had once fielded thousands of warriors could now barely muster hundreds. The economic base that had sustained the warrior class was gone, Messenia remaining independent and hostile. The unity that had made Sparta formidable had shattered into factions of rich and poor, traditionalists and reformers, those who wanted to preserve what little remained, and those who saw only pointless stubbornness in maintaining dead customs. Under Roman hegemony, Sparta received special status as a free city, permitted to maintain its peculiar institutions, exempt from certain Roman taxes, allowed to govern itself according to traditional laws. The Romans were collectors of interesting things, and Sparta fascinated them. These stern conquerors who valued discipline and military excellence above all else saw in Sparta a mirror of their own values, or at least what they imagined their values to be. Roman nobles began visiting Sparta the way later tourists would visit ancient ruins. They came to see the agoge in action, to watch boys being trained in the traditional Spartan manner. They came to witness the diamastagosis, the ritual flogging at the altar of Artemis Orthia. What had been sacred rite, what had been a test of endurance that separated warriors from failures, became spectator sport. Imagine what this meant for Spartans. Boys who underwent the flogging now did so in front of foreign audiences, who whispered and pointed and took notes. The pain was the same, the blood was real, but the meaning had changed. They were no longer proving themselves to their fellow Spartans, earning their place in the warrior brotherhood. They were performing for tourists. The ritual that had forged warriors for centuries had become entertainment. The visitors paid well, of course. Roman gold flowed into Sparta, enriching those who controlled access to these traditional spectacles. Guides offered tours of the ancient sites. Here is where Leonidas trained. There is the council chamber where kings once debated war. This is the route the phalanx would take when marching out to battle. The guides told the old stories with practiced enthusiasm. Tales of Thermopylae and Plataea, of Lycurgus, and the 300, of warriors who valued honor above life. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so sad. Sparta, which had rejected wealth and commerce for centuries, which had used iron bars as currency specifically to prevent the accumulation of money, which had exiled citizens who showed too much interest in foreign luxuries, now depended economically on tourism and wealthy visitors. The city that had produced the finest warriors in Greece now produced theatrical reenactments of warrior culture for foreign consumption. The Syssitia continued, but with imported delicacies rather than black broth. The men still dined together, still maintained the forms of communal eating that had built brotherhood and equality. But some Syssitia were now patronized by wealthy Romans who wanted to experience authentic Spartan dining. The food was better than in Lycurgus's day, wine from Italian vineyards, olive oil from Sicily, cheese from throughout the Roman world. The company included not just warriors but administrators, businessmen, guides, and translators. The conversations were in Greek and Latin, discussing not battle tactics but trade arrangements and tourist schedules. Young men still went through the agoge, but the training had changed. It remained harsh by the standards of other cities. Sparta could not completely abandon its identity, but it no longer produced warriors who expected to die in battle for their city. It produced young men who would inherit their fathers' businesses, who would manage estates and negotiate with Roman officials, who would lead comfortable lives in a comfortable province of a vast empire. Some Romans, paradoxically, became more devoted to Spartan ideals than Spartans themselves. They read Plutarch's biography of Lycurgus and romanticized Spartan austerity while sitting in luxurious villas. They praised Spartan discipline while indulging in every comfort Roman civilization offered. They held up Sparta as an ideal that Rome should emulate, never quite grasping that Sparta as they imagined it had never truly existed, and Sparta as it actually was had always been more complex than the simple stories suggested. Emperor Augustus, who would transform Rome from republic to empire, showed particular favor to Sparta. He granted privileges, supported the restoration of old monuments, encouraged the maintenance of traditional customs. His reasons were partly practical. A grateful Sparta was a peaceful Sparta, but partly ideological. Augustus was trying to restore traditional Roman values after decades of civil war, and he saw Sparta as a model of the kind of disciplined, martial society he wanted Rome to be. Under Roman patronage, Sparta enjoyed a kind of renaissance. Buildings were repaired, temples rebuilt, festivals revived. If you visited Sparta in the 1st century after Christ, you might almost believe the city was prospering. The agora would be bustling with activity. The gymnasiums would be full of training youth. The festivals would be celebrated with traditional fervor. It was all very impressive, but look closer and you would see that it was hollow. The buildings were restored, yes, but they were maintained by Roman money. The youth were training, but they would never fight in a phalanx. The festivals were celebrated, but they were as much for tourists as for Spartans. It was a museum pretending to be a living city, a theme park of ancient values in a world that had moved on. The Spartans themselves seemed aware of this contradiction. Some embraced it pragmatically. If Romans wanted to pay to see traditional Spartan customs, why not provide them? Others found it degrading but necessary, maintaining the forms because without them Sparta would have no identity at all. Still others retreated into nostalgia, telling themselves and anyone who would listen about the glorious past, when Spartan warriors had been invincible, when the scarlet cloaks had inspired terror, when Sparta had been great. The past became an oppressive weight. Every current Spartan was measured against ancestors who had stood at Thermopylae, who had conquered Messenia, who had defeated Athens. How could any modern Spartan match such standards? The answer was that they couldn't, and so they simply performed the rituals that connected them to that past, maintained the traditions that gave them identity, and tried not to think too deeply about what it all meant. As the Roman Empire itself entered its troubled centuries, Sparta's situation worsened. The tourism that had sustained the city declined as travel became dangerous. Roman money, spread increasingly thin across a vast empire facing multiple threats, became scarce. The special privileges Sparta enjoyed seemed less important too. Roman administrators dealing with barbarian invasions and political chaos. In 375 after Christ, another massive earthquake struck Laconia. The earth that had destroyed so many Spartans 1100 years earlier struck again. Buildings that had survived centuries, monuments that had witnessed the rise and fall of Spartan power, temples that had received sacrifices for generations, all came crashing down in moments of violent shaking. This time, there was no King Archidamus to organize resistance, no warrior discipline to impose order on chaos. The population, already reduced to a few thousand, fled to higher ground. The city that had needed no walls because its citizens were its walls was abandoned. People scattered to surrounding villages, seeking safety wherever they could find it. The ruins of Sparta stood empty. Wind blew through the collapsed gymnasiums where boys had trained. Rain fell on the broken temples where Spartans had prayed to gods who no longer answered. The agora, where councils had debated war and peace, grew wild with weeds. The barracks where warriors had lived in austere brotherhood crumbled slowly, stone by stone, returning to the earth from which they had been raised. In 396 after Christ, Alaric and his Visigoths swept through Greece. They were looking for treasure, for food, for anything of value. They came to the ruins of Sparta and found almost nothing worth taking. The city that had once possessed the finest warriors in Greece had accumulated little material wealth that, at least, Lycurgus's anti-luxury laws had accomplished. What temples remained standing were stripped of their bronze fittings and any gold decoration, but there was surprisingly little to loot. The Visigoths moved on. Sparta was not even worth destroying, because there was so little left to destroy. A few people still lived in the area, farming the fertile Eurotas Valley as people had farmed it since before the Dorians arrived. They called themselves Spartans and told stories about their ancestors who had been warriors without equal. But the Sparta of Leonidas and Lycurgus was gone as completely as if it had never existed. Consider what this meant. A civilization that had dominated Greece for centuries, that had produced warriors so formidable that their reputation alone could win battles, that had created a social system so distinctive that it remained famous for millennia. This civilization left almost nothing behind. There were no great temples like the Parthenon. There was no literature to compare with Athens' plays and philosophy. There was no art, no sculpture, no architecture of note. Sparta had deliberately rejected all such things as unnecessary luxuries that distracted from the primary purpose of creating warriors. And so when the warriors were gone, when the need for warriors had passed, when the world had moved on to different forms of combat and different social systems, Sparta had nothing else. The single-minded focus that had been their strength became their epitaph. They had perfected one thing, the production of disciplined heavy infantry, and when that skill became obsolete, they had nothing to fall back on. The site where Sparta once stood was inhabited again. Centuries later, a small city rose, eventually taking the name Sparti, but it had no connection to ancient Sparta beyond geography. The people who lived there were Greeks, like other Greeks, farming and trading and living ordinary lives. They knew the old stories, of course. Every Greek child learned about Thermopylae, but they were no more Spartan than modern Italians or Roman legionaries. Archaeologists eventually came digging carefully through the layers of earth and time, trying to recover what Sparta had been. They found remarkably little. The Spartans had built simply, maintained minimally, and created almost nothing meant to endure. The city that had once awed Greece left fewer traces than mining camps abandoned after gold ran out. Yet in its absence, in the very emptiness where Sparta once stood, the legend grew stronger. Because there was so little physical evidence, imagination could fill the void. Because the Spartans themselves had written almost nothing down, others could project onto them whatever values seemed admirable. The gap between historical Sparta and mythical Sparta grew wider with each generation that told the story. The twilight had been long and sad. From Leuctra to the final abandonment was nearly 700 years, 7 centuries of decline, punctuated by brief rallies, of traditions maintained with decreasing conviction, of warriors becoming performers, becoming memories, becoming myths. Other civilizations collapsed suddenly, destroyed by conquest or catastrophe in a historical eye blink. Sparta faded gradually, like a sunset that takes hours to complete, the light dimming so slowly that each moment seems almost unchanged from the one before, until suddenly you realize darkness has arrived and the day is gone. But the darkness was not complete, because while the physical Sparta disappeared, while the warriors died and the buildings crumbled and the city was abandoned, something persisted. The idea of Sparta, the story of Sparta, the inspiration of Sparta, these proved more durable than bronze or stone. These would outlast the ruins and speak to generations that would never see a Spartan warrior, but would nevertheless know what Spartan meant. The twilight was ending. Night was falling on the city in the Eurotas Valley. But elsewhere, in minds and books and dreams, a different Sparta was being born, one that would never die because it had never truly lived, except in the space between history and legend where all our most powerful myths reside. There are stories that refuse to die. Long after the people who lived them have turned to dust, long after their cities have crumbled and their languages have been forgotten, the stories persist. They change in the telling, adapt to new audiences, take on meanings their original subjects never intended, but they endure. The story of Sparta is one of these immortal tales. Stand in the Eurotas Valley today and you will find a modest Greek city called Sparti, home to about 30,000 people living thoroughly modern lives. They drive cars past apartment buildings and coffee shops. They use smartphones and watch satellite television. Children play soccer where the ancient Agog once forged warriors from boys. Olive groves and orange trees grow where the phalanx once drilled. If you search for ancient Sparta, you will find scattered stones, a small museum, and disappointment. Most visitors expect something like Athens with its towering Acropolis and magnificent Parthenon. They expect temples and theatres, monuments and marble. They expect visible proof of greatness. Instead, they find almost nothing. A few foundation stones, some scattered ruins barely distinguishable from natural rock. The theatre was built by Romans long after Sparta's power had faded. The stadium is reconstructed. not original. The famous simplicity that defined Sparta in life defines it in death. They left almost nothing to see. And yet, despite this absence, perhaps because of this absence, Sparta has achieved a kind of immortality that Athens, for all its monuments, might envy. Because while Athens must compete with its own ruins, while the physical Parthenon sets limits on what the mythical Athens can be, Sparta exists primarily in imagination. The lack of physical remains means each generation can reconstruct Sparta according to its own values and needs. This process began almost immediately after Sparta's decline. The Romans, building their own warrior culture, looked to Sparta for inspiration and validation. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor who spent years leading armies on Rome's frontiers, kept Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus among his personal possessions. He found in Spartan austerity a reflection of Stoic principles, the subordination of personal comfort to duty, the acceptance of hardship as character building, the primacy of virtue over pleasure. Roman legionaries were told they were the new Spartans, disciplined and deadly, superior to the barbarian hordes they faced. The gladius short sword that Roman soldiers carried was deliberately similar to the Spartan xiphos. The emphasis on unit cohesion over individual glory echoed Spartan phalanx tactics. When Roman generals wanted to inspire their troops before battle, they invoked Thermopylae and Leonidas, reminding soldiers of what disciplined warriors could achieve against impossible odds. But even as Rome borrowed from Sparta's military legacy, they avoided its social extremism. No Roman seriously proposed taking 7-year-old boys from their families and raising them in military barracks. No Roman advocated the helot system or the brutal crypteia. The Romans took what they wanted from the Spartan story: the emphasis on discipline, the warrior ethos, the willingness to sacrifice, and left behind what seemed barbaric or impractical. When Rome fell and Europe entered its medieval period, Sparta might have been forgotten entirely, but the classical text survived, preserved in monasteries and later in Islamic centers of learning. Plutarch's biographies circulated. Herodotus's account of Thermopylae was copied and recopied. Spartan aphorisms, "Come back with your shield or on it," if molon labe, passed from text to text, from language to language. Medieval knights discovering these classical accounts saw themselves reflected in Spartan warriors. Here were men who valued honor above life, who lived by strict codes of conduct, who trained from childhood for combat, who saw warfare as the highest calling. The parallels seemed obvious, even though the social contexts were entirely different. Chivalric romances began incorporating Spartan elements, blending them with Christian virtues and feudal obligations to create new mythologies. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical antiquity. Scholars rediscovered and translated ancient texts. They debated what Sparta had been and what lessons it offered. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing about politics and power in the early 1600s, analyzed Sparta's mixed constitution, combining monarchy, oligarchy, and limited democracy as a model of governmental stability. He noted that Sparta's constitution had endured for centuries, while other Greek states experienced constant revolution and upheaval. But Machiavelli also recognized Sparta's limitations. A state organized entirely for war was ill-suited for peace. A society that rejected commerce and innovation stagnated. Sparta had achieved remarkable things, but it had also trapped itself in a system that could not adapt. For Machiavelli, Sparta was both inspiration and cautionary tale, proof that discipline and unity created power, but also proof that single-minded focus contained its own dangers. As Europe moved toward enlightenment, different thinkers found different Spartans. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, criticizing the corruption and artificiality of modern society, held up Sparta as an example of republican virtue and civic dedication. He admired how Spartans subordinated personal desires to collective good, how they valued simplicity over luxury, how they created citizens devoted to their polis rather than to private gain. Rousseau's idealized Sparta influenced revolutionary movements across Europe and America. The founders of the American Republic debated Spartan models along with Roman and Athenian ones. Some saw in Sparta's mixed constitution a template for balancing different forms of government. Others warned against Sparta's militarism and rigidity. The debates were passionate because they mattered. These men were designing a new nation and looking to history for guidance. Sparta offered lessons, though Americans disagreed about what those lessons were. The French Revolution made Sparta explicitly political. Revolutionaries held up Spartan virtue against aristocratic decadence. They praised Spartan equality, conveniently overlooking that this equality existed only among a small citizen class supported by enslaved helots. Maximilien Robespierre invoked Sparta when justifying revolutionary terror. The collective good required sacrifice. Discipline demanded obedience. Creating a virtuous republic necessitated harsh measures. That his Sparta bore little resemblance to historical Sparta did not diminish its rhetorical power. The 19th century brought new interpretations. As nationalism swept Europe, different nations claimed Sparta as spiritual ancestor. Germans saw Prussian military discipline reflected in Spartan training. The British found parallels between Spartan public school education, harsh character building, creating leaders through ordeal, and their own boarding school system. The French viewed Sparta through the lens of republican virtue. Each nation discovered the Sparta it needed to justify its own values and institutions. Military academies worldwide studied Spartan tactics and training methods. West Point in America, Sandhurst in Britain, Saint Cyr in France, all incorporated elements supposedly derived from Sparta. Cadets learned about Thermopylae as the ultimate example of holding ground against overwhelming odds. The concept of unit cohesion over individual glory came directly from phalanx warfare. The idea that hardship in training prevented failure in combat echoed the Agoges' brutal pedagogy. But the 20th century complicated Sparta's legacy. Nazi Germany embraced Spartan imagery with disturbing enthusiasm. They saw in Sparta a master race maintaining dominance over inferior peoples. They praised Spartan eugenics, the exposure of weak infants, the breeding programs, the Crypteia's systematic murder of potentially rebellious helots. They held up Sparta as proof that a warrior state could achieve greatness through ruthlessness and racial purity. This association tainted Sparta's image for generations, linking it to ideologies of supremacy and genocide. After World War II, Sparta became controversial. How should we view a society that practiced infanticide, enslaved its neighbors, and raised children in state-controlled military training? The simple admiration of earlier centuries gave way to more critical examination. Historians emphasized aspects previously minimized: the brutality of the helot system, the rigidity that prevented adaptation, the demographic crisis inherent in Spartan social organization. Sparta became less a model to emulate and more a case study in how societies fail. Yet even criticism could not kill the legend, because stripped of historical complexity, reduced to its essential narrative, Sparta's story remains powerfully resonant. 300 warriors choosing death over surrender speaks to something deep in human psychology. The idea of subordinating self to cause, of achieving excellence through discipline, of standing firm when others flee. These concepts transcend any particular ideology. Sparta as symbol persists regardless of Sparta as historical reality. Modern special forces worldwide embrace Spartan imagery. The Navy SEALs, British SAS, Israeli commandos, elite units that demand extreme commitment and endure brutal training all invoke Spartan precedent. Not because they practice infanticide or enslave neighbors, but because Sparta represents the idea that excellence requires sacrifice, that ordinary humans can be forged into extraordinary warriors through disciplined suffering. The physical Sparta is irrelevant. The metaphorical Sparta is everywhere. Popular culture has amplified this modern mythology. Films like 300 present Sparta in terms that would astonish ancient Spartans, bare-chested warriors with rippling muscles, fighting with acrobatic fury against grotesque enemies. It is historically absurd. Real Spartan warriors wore heavy armor and fought in tight formation, but historical accuracy misses the point. These modern Spartans represent an idea that courage, discipline, and refusal to submit can triumph over superior numbers. That warriors who embrace death need fear nothing. That there are causes worth dying for. Athletic competitions invoke Sparta constantly. Spartan races challenge participants to overcome obstacles through physical and mental toughness. CrossFit gyms display lambda shields and quote Spartan aphorisms. Motivational speakers tell stories of Thermopylae to inspire corporate teams. Sparta has become shorthand for pushing past limits, for choosing the hard path, for refusing to quit. Whether this has anything to do with historical Sparta matters less than what Sparta represents in modern consciousness. And what does it represent? Perhaps different things to different people. To some, Sparta symbolizes discipline and self-denial in a world of self-indulgence and instant gratification. To others, it represents toxic masculinity and militarism taken to dangerous extremes. To some, the 300 at Thermopylae are heroes defending civilization. To others, they are propaganda tools used to justify war and violence. To some, Spartan training methods offer lessons in character development. To others, they demonstrate how societies abuse children in service of state power. All of these interpretations have some validity because Sparta itself was complex and contradictory. They created warriors of almost superhuman discipline while systematically terrorizing enslaved populations. They achieved military excellence while producing almost nothing of lasting cultural value. They demonstrated what humans could endure while also demonstrating what humans could inflict on each other. They saved Greek civilization from Persian conquest while also embodying many values we now reject. Perhaps this is why Sparta endures, not because it offers simple lessons or clear moral guidance, but because it poses difficult questions. What are we willing to sacrifice for excellence? When does discipline become tyranny? Can a society organized entirely around a single purpose ever be healthy? What is lost when we value collective good over individual happiness? How do we create strong communities without becoming rigid and brutal? There are no easy answers. Sparta itself found no lasting answers. The system Lycurgus created was brilliant and terrible, effective and ultimately fatal. It produced warriors without equal but could not sustain the population needed to field them. It created discipline that won battles but rigidity that prevented adaptation. It subordinated individual desires to collective power so thoroughly that when the power faded, nothing remained but empty rituals and tourist attractions. And yet the story persists. Walk through that valley where eagles still circle above Mount Taygetos. Feel the wind coming down from mountains that watched the Dorians arrive, that saw Leonidas march to Thermopylae, that witnessed Sparta's rise and fall and final fading. The city is gone. The warriors are dust. The social system that created them has been extinct for millennia. But something remains in the landscape, in the light, in the weight of accumulated history pressing down on this particular place. Or perhaps what remains exists not in the valley, but in us, in the human need for stories about courage and sacrifice, about discipline and duty, about standing firm when all seems lost. Sparta offers such stories. Whether they are true in every detail matters less than whether they are true to something deeper, the human capacity for extraordinary dedication, for choosing the hard path, for valuing honor above comfort. The bronze is silent now. The spears are rust. The shields that once locked together in perfect formation are scattered fragments in museum displays. But the echo continues. Whenever soldiers face impossible odds, whenever athletes push past the pain, whenever people choose difficulty over ease because difficulty leads to excellence, there is something Spartan in the choice. Not because ancient Spartans were perfect or their society was ideal, but because they demonstrated in the most extreme way possible what humans can achieve when they commit entirely to a single purpose. The physical Sparta died. The ideological Sparta became a pawn in other people's political games. But the mythical Sparta, the Sparta of pure discipline and absolute courage, where 300 men could hold back 1,000,000, where warriors smiled at death, and mothers told sons to return victorious or not at all, that Sparta will never die. It exists in the space between history and inspiration, where facts become legend, and legend becomes something more powerful than facts ever were. Thermopylae happened more than 2,000 years ago. Leuctra and Plataea are battles that almost no one remembers without prompting. The Agoge produced its last warrior centuries before America was discovered. And yet, Spartan remains a word with instant meaning, a concept that needs no explanation, a standard against which we measure discipline and dedication. That is Sparta's true immortality, not in ruins or records, but in language itself, in the way we talk about excellence and sacrifice and standing firm. The story is ending now, at least this telling of it, but the story itself will not end. Tomorrow someone will watch a film about Thermopylae, or read a book about ancient warfare, or simply see the word Spartan and wonder what it means. They will discover some version of the story, perhaps historically accurate, perhaps wildly mythologized, probably somewhere in between, and they will take from it what they need: inspiration or warning, admiration or horror, lessons about strength or cautionary tales about rigidity. The valley is quiet now. The Eurotas flows as it always has, indifferent to the civilizations that rise and fall along its banks. The mountains stand eternal, watching with the patience of stone. Wild flowers grow through fallen foundations. Olive trees shade places where warriors once bled. The land remembers nothing, but the land needs remember nothing. Memory lives elsewhere now, in books and minds, and the stories we tell ourselves about what humans can be, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is more than most civilizations achieve. Sparta wanted glory. Sparta wanted immortality. Sparta wanted to be remembered as the greatest warriors who ever lived. In their own way, on their own terms, they succeeded. Not through monuments or literature or art, but through story, through the pure, distilled image of warriors who would not bend, who could not be broken, who stood at a narrow pass and chose death over retreat. They are gone. But the echo of bronze on bronze, of shields locking together, of Leonidas saying, "Come and take them," to an emperor, that echo continues. It will continue. Long after we ourselves have become history, long after our own civilization has risen and fallen and been succeeded by others we cannot imagine, someone will still tell the story of 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. Because some stories are too powerful to die, some echoes never fade, some legends are eternal. This is the immortality Sparta earned. Not the immortality they intended, not the endless military dominance they sought, but something stranger and perhaps more valuable. They live in imagination now, in metaphor, in the space where history becomes myth and myth becomes meaning. The warriors are gone, the echo remains, and that echo says, courage matters, discipline matters, standing firm matters, even in the face of certain defeat, especially in the face of certain defeat. The story is told, the echo continues. Sparta endures.